Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys, so they say. Whether that's an excuse for bad behavior, or it's an endearing little fun thing to say when boys act goofy. It's hard to say. Growing up, it was the second one. I went to a very small grade school in a very small rural town where we had 2 grades in each classroom. Downstairs was kindergarten by itself. Next door was 1st and 2nd grade, 3rd and 4th grade, and upstairs was 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th. There was probably 10 or 11 kids in each grade. Now back then, the boys that were delinquents were that lovable type of goofy delinquent. The kind that occasionally smarts off to the teacher, but it isn't anything crazy serious. Or the type of delinquent that burps or farts when everyone's supposed to be reading silently, and then everyone bursts out laughing, and the teacher has a hard time getting everyone under control. That type of delinquent that's only slightly worse than Zach Morris on Saved by the Bell. The sad thing is, sometimes these delinquents don't grow up and change. Sometimes they get worse. And sometimes boys will be boys turns into something worse. Let's call one of these boys Daniel. Let's call the other boy Lance. Daniel and Lance, as they grew older and reached high school age, started to experiment with drugs, and they had been drinking since they were in 7th and 8th grade. By sophomore year, they had both dropped out, and they started doing drugs a lot more often. Now, Daniel was violent. Lance was not. Lance had his issues with drugs, but he wasn't a bad person. Daniel was a little different. He was wired differently. They were both very good friends. They'd been friends since grade school. They'd been on a lot of adventures together. A lot of them inappropriate. Lance was trying to get himself together a little bit. Trying to clean himself up. Get himself a job. Daniel wasn't having that. He didn't seem to want that to happen. He didn't want anything to change. One night, Daniel and Lance were hanging out at Lance's house. Lance's father was asleep. They had had a few drinks. Daniel pulled out some drugs. Lance refused because he wasn't trying to get messed up. Daniel got a little angry and pressed and pressed and nagged until Lance agreed that he would take a little, but that this was absolutely the last time. Sure, whatever, Daniel said. Well, Daniel was very messed up. Somehow Lance was so messed up that he could barely walk. Daniel claimed that he didn't really remember why, but they took a walk out behind Lance's house, and that's the last thing he remembers. He said he woke up in his own bed. Lance's father found Lance the next morning outside in the woods behind his house. He had a bruise around his eye, and he had drowned in the very smallest, teensiest puddle you'd ever seen. Now, people had their suspicions about what had happened, but everyone knew how Daniel was, and no one wanted to say anything bad about him because they were afraid themselves. Lance had a funeral, and Daniel attended and pretended to mourn. And life went on for a little bit. One night, Daniel was laying in bed. And he heard a scratching at his door. He ignored it and started to fall asleep. A little while later, the scratching got louder. Thinking that it was his cat, he walked over to his door and slowly opened it to let her in. Instead, he came face to face with Lance. His face was pale. Skin was melting off of his body. He opened his mouth and moaned. Daniel passed out. When he woke up, he was freaking out. His mother called the police because he was threatening to kill himself. When the police arrived, Daniel immediately confessed that he didn't drown Lance, but he had given him some laced drugs and punched him in the face when they got in an argument and left him in the puddle. People will be people, but some people are wired a little differently.